Welcome back to Now What with me, Robert Peston, the ITV News programme in which we dig into the big issues that affect the future of all of us. Now, I'm delighted today to be joined by Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can't imagine what we're going to talk about. There's literally nothing going on in the world.
It's a very quiet time.
It's a very quiet time indeed. I'd like, though, to kick off with certainly an event for the Prime Minister that she thinks was terribly important, which was the formulation, some would say at last, of her vision for Britain's relationship with the European Union after we leave, which she agreed with her cabinet at Chequers and has now put into a white paper. You've had a few days to look at that white paper. What did you make of it?
Well, before I reply specifically about the white paper, I think I ought to put things in context. I was a very strong supporter of the Remain campaign. I think that was the right decision. I believe we have made a dramatic, momentous error in leaving the European Union, and I think that will become apparent, not suddenly and dramatically, but increasingly year after year after year. We will begin to learn what we're losing, both in growth and in national prestige. I'm sure we'll come to economic matters later.
Sure.
But in terms of prestige, if I may, I'd mention two things before I come directly to the white paper. It's an extraordinary time to leave the European Union. This is the moment in which China is becoming more powerful, America is becoming more powerful, Russia at the eastern end of Europe is being very aggressive and behaving very badly. And at precisely that moment, we choose to leave Europe, which not only weakens us, but more important to the rest of the world, actually weakens Europe. And if Europe doesn't have the same relationship with the United States that once it did, and it plainly doesn't, then I think that is extremely dangerous. And the second point is very UK-centric. We have done extraordinarily well over the years, since the Second World War, or pretty much soon after, in having a relationship both with the European Union and being in a special position with the United States, not least because we were members of the European Union and could represent our joint interests within the European Union. And now we're leaving Europe at a time when there's every sign that the United States is moving away from us. So I think that leaves us more isolated than we should be.
So I did want to drill down into this. Your view would be that the election in America of Trump actually reinforces the case for closer relations. Well, you would want us to stay in the European Union. Explain why that is.
Well, I voted for us to stay within the European Union.
No, but explain why Trump makes a difference.
Well, I think Trump makes a difference for several reasons. Firstly, Trump is more disengaged from Europe than any of his predecessors. He's more disengaged from NATO than any of his predecessors. He's more unpredictable, and that matters in terms of diplomacy and foreign affairs. He's more unpredictable than any president I've ever seen. Now, a combination of America moving away from Europe and an unpredictable president makes decision-making on policy much more difficult across Europe, in terms, not least, of course, of defence, but not only in defence. So I think that places Britain in a rather less enviable position than once she was. We were very well sheltered with the European Union on one side and America on the other. We're now in the process of losing both of them, which, as Lady Bracknell might have said, is careless.
I mean, some would argue that because of his hostility to the European Union, he makes no secret that he's not a fan of the EU, that Britain out of the EU might paradoxically have more influence with him. But you obviously don't agree with that.
I absolutely flatly disagree with that. I mean, every American president I worked with or met and spoke to and knew, and that's Reagan right up to the present president, all of them saw an important part of our relationship with America being our influence inside the European Union.
Yeah, we were the bridge.
Well, we were more than the bridge. We were the bridge. Of course we were at times of difficulty, but we were more than that. We were in Europe with many shared ideals with America, particularly on things like free trade. We didn't act as America's poodle inside the European Union, but we said what we believed, and what we believed on those issues was the same as the United States. And so we were more than a bridge, we were also an anchor to windward. Now that has gone. And it's difficult to see now that has gone, how the relationship with America isn't going to diminish from what it was. It won't disappear. We're still a huge trading partner with America, a huge investor in America, and vice versa. But it will be diminished. it will be less close. We will be less relevant. And to be less relevant both to the European power bloc and the American power bloc is not sensible policy for a nation of 65 million people.
I mean, do you think that there is the faintest chance of Britain concluding a genuinely useful trade deal with America? I mean, last week we had this bizarre spectacle of the American president at one point saying there is going to be no deal, and then the next day saying, well, he hoped there would. I mean, what do you make of all that?
Well, there's a lot of difference between Friday and Saturday in terms of what Mr. Trump said. Do I think we can get a trade deal with America? Yes, of course we can. Is it a trade deal that is going to be particularly favourable to the UK rather than the United States? That I'm much more doubtful about. Of course we can get a trade deal, but are we in a strong negotiating position? No, we are not.
We have a surplus with America after all, so you would assume that Trump would try and alter the terms of trade in their favour.
Well, you only have to see what Trump has said. He's frustrated that he can't sell his corn, his chickens, his beef, all of which means a deep penetration, if we're to have a trade deal, right into our agricultural market. How are the arable lands of East Anglia going to match up against the great arable lands in the Midwest? I don't think that they can. And so, of course, we can do a trade deal with America, and it may be a marginal help to us, but it will predominantly be of interest to America. And the belief that a trade deal with America can replace the extraordinary trade relationship, unparalleled at any time in history, that we have with the whole of the European Union is fanciful. It simply can't. This argument that we can march out into the world as a global nation, though if I may say so, I think we've been a global nation for 250 years, if not more. Nonsense to say we're suddenly going to go global. But the belief...
we are global. The City of London
we are
is
global.
the most global financial centre in the world.
And the most cosmopolitan and the most global. And we have been for a long time. The argument that Brexit is suddenly going to make us go global is laughable. But so is the concept that we're suddenly going to march out and get really favourable trade deals for the 65 million Brits with China, with India. Does anybody seriously think we're going to penetrate the Indian services market in the way we've been trying to do for years? I don't really think that is so. And with the United States, as we've just talked, I think of course we'll do a deal, but it won't be a deal that is mega favourable to the UK. So we surrender on the day we leave the European Union 53 trade deals that we have by virtue of being a member of the European Union. Those 53 trade deals cover about 70 countries, the Caribbeans being together, for example. Now, we can renegotiate those, but are we going to renegotiate them as successfully as 65 million as the European Union managed to do as 500 million? No, I think that is extremely unlikely. How long will it take? Well, I don't know how well Liam Fox is getting on with this, but I think it is likely to take many years before we have these trade deals. On the day we leave, they won't be there. Those 53 trade deals would have gone. It will take years to replace them. We don't even have any trade negotiators of any real experience. We're having to buy in trade negotiators. So we are isolating ourselves in a whole range of ways that was not made apparent during the referendum. The point is perfectly clear. Many of the people who voted to leave the European Union did so on the basis of a whole series of promises that were pie in the sky, that were fanciful, that were not realisable and will not be realised. It was, if you remember, going to be the easiest trade deal ever with the European Union. We'd do it in an afternoon. Well, that's plainly not so. And there was a whole range of promises of that sort, which people are going to find out too late, having voted,
well, you say
were not true.
You say too late. You will have noticed that the former Education Secretary, who served in Theresa May's cabinet till quite recently, Justine Greening, said yesterday that she feels the paralysis in Parliament when it comes to making a decision about the kind of Brexit that is right for the country means she thinks ultimately there will have to be another referendum to sort this out. She wants a a referendum with three choices, and you would have to rank your top two, and those three choices would be whatever deal Theresa May gets, exit without a deal, or staying in the EU. Is she right? Ultimately, is there a strong case for a further referendum?
Well, let me refer back to something I said some months ago and then build on it in terms of another possible referendum. I argued a long time ago that when the negotiations were completed, that there should be a free vote in Parliament upon whether to accept them or reject them or send the negotiators back. Because at the end of this, if it goes badly wrong, we need to be clear that Parliament as a whole, not Parliament as instructed by the whips, but Parliament as a whole, in this unique negotiation, actually approves of what has been done.
But can I just ask you about one point about that, though, which is, under our system, it's very hard to give Parliament that power if at the end of the day you've got an executive which takes a different view from Parliament. And, you know, you could in those circumstances say, well, if Parliament has rejected Theresa May's deal, the logic of that is you've got to put together a coalition government that would then somehow translate what Parliament wants into a formal negotiating position with the rest of the EU. Quite hard to do with our system, though, isn't it?
It is unprecedented, but we are in an unprecedented position. Let me continue the argument to pick up the points that Justine Greening made the other day. Is there a case for a second referendum? Undoubtedly there is. There is for several reasons. Firstly, a majority of people voted to leave the European Union. But the majority was only 37% of the electorate. 63% either voted to stay in or did not vote, which means either they were completely disinterested or, like many other people, they thought the vote was certainly going to be won and they didn't bother to turn out. For whatever reason, there was a majority to leave, but it was only 37%. Parliament made a terrible error in not having a threshold. And so on that tiny percentage, that minority percentage of 37%, we are changing the whole direction of the country. Secondly, people voted on an entirely false prospectus. I touched upon this a moment ago, I needn't elaborate upon it, except to say that the vast majority of the promises made to people of a land and milk and honey when we have left the European Union are pie in the sky. They are simply not going to happen. And at some stage, the public will learn that they're not going to happen, and that there will then, I think, be a terrible backlash against those people who made promises and forced through a Brexit, and then people found that they were worse off, not better off. You will recall the leaked government documents, which show that every region of the country would be worse off. And some regions, like under any of three different models. And nobody was going to be better off. We would all be worse off. We have voted to be poorer, whatever sort of Brexit we get. And in places like the North East, which heaven alone knows are in enough difficulty and have been for a very long time, no one in government in the last 50 years can be very pleased about the way the North East, for example, has fallen behind. They could fall behind again by another 16% on the government's own figures. Now, those are facts. Well, I say they're facts, they are probabilities. I know experts are to be denounced these days and one mustn't listen to them, but I'd rather listen to an expert than an amateur, I must say. If those are probable, they are facts available to the public that were not available to the public when they voted last time. So I think there is a perfectly sound case for a second referendum. But it isn't straightforward, because there are complications with a second referendum. There are complications as to what questions you put. There's the democratic disruption of having it. So I'm in the position that I wouldn't rule it out at this stage, because I think there is a credible, justifiable case for a second referendum. But at this stage, I wouldn't necessarily advocate it. So can I get the point
I made, which is, if Parliament were to reject whatever deal the Prime Minister brings back, would you at that point think that the sensible course would be for some kind of coalition government to be formed, where essentially Parliament would, choose, or some it's quite difficult to know how this would actually happen, but somehow, enough MPs who thought that the Brexit decision was more important than party politics, and there would be enough of them somehow to form a new executive.
Well, I think that's theoretically right. I'm not sure in practice it would prove right.
So do you think we'd have a general election? I mean, what do you think would happen?
I think we could be forced into. I think there are several scenarios in which we could be forced into a general election. If we move forward in the way that at the moment it seems to me we are beginning to head, which is towards a negotiation that ends up with no deal, because whatever the Prime Minister puts forward is voted down in Parliament, including the white paper which we started with and didn't come back to. I'll come back to that.
I would be careful.
I hadn't forgotten the white paper.
Neither have I.
If things like that are voted down, then we are heading for an exit without a deal.
Yeah.
And I must say, it does seem to me that there are people in Parliament who would be perfectly content to have an exit with no deal. I think it would be catastrophic for people who are poor, catastrophic for all of us, but most catastrophic for those who are poor. Those who have least are going to be hurt most if we get a no deal exit. But if we're moving towards a no deal, I think once we come to a no deal, it is difficult to see how a general election could be avoided, and difficult to see how an election for Prime Minister could be avoided if we come to no deal.
Yeah.
And if those, the hard, most convinced Brexit supporters continue to say there is no compromise, whatever is put forward is going to be rejected, then that is the route in which we are headed.
Okay.
And it would be disastrous for the UK. So coming back to the white paper, the white paper isn't perfect. It isn't what I would have liked to have seen.
So we've got two central elements. One is this sort of new, effectively, Prime Minister hopes, it's almost like the single market, but just for goods.
Yes.
No tariffs, following EU regulations, just for goods and food.
It's obviously deeply inferior to the single market and the customs union. And indeed, the whole mess that we're in is because of the inability to deal with the problem of the Northern Ireland border and the reluctance of the government to stay in a customs union because it is said it stops them controlling immigration. Now, I think when you examine that case is much, much weaker than anybody has put forward, much weaker on several grounds. The first responsibility of a government, I think, is apart from defence and security issues, is the material welfare of the nation. And on the government's own figures, as I indicated some time ago, the material well-being of the nation will be hurt, will be diminished by leaving Europe. That is an argument for me that is, if I may borrow the word, sovereign over any other argument. And I would have preferred the Prime Minister to say after the referendum, there was a slender margin for leaving. We are going to have to leave the European Union. That is decided. That is no longer an argument. But at the same time, opinion polls were saying that people wish to stay in the single market and the customs union. And not only that, some of the Brexiteers actually said that. We will get exactly the same benefits as we would have got in the single market. In the absence of that, it would be perfectly credible to say we'll stay in the single market and the customs union, and then most of the other arguments would fall away, and we would get...
There are some who say David Cameron could have done that on the morning of the vote, but of course he chose to resign. So do you think he made a mistake in resigning rather than simply saying the people have spoken, we will now apply to be members of the EEA and the customs union?
I think it would have been very difficult for him not to resign.
Really?
I think it would have been very difficult.
Well, despite the fact that throughout the campaign he said he wouldn't resign if he lost.
Yes, well, what else could he have said? But I think it would have been... It's easy to be critical. And
no, I'm not trying to be critical, I'm just asking your view.
No, I'm not suggesting you were. But I think it would have been very difficult for him not to have resigned in the circumstances of having called the referendum, advocated a course to the British nation, and seen that course rejected by the British nation. I think it would have been a very unenviable position to have remained in post.
But just to be clear, therefore, about the white paper, so we've got a second best, you think, in the proposals.
It's a second best, but it's a basis for negotiation.
For goods. You don't presumably also like this very complicated customs arrangement where we'd be collecting their duties, they'd be, and our own customs duties, and then we'd be tracking goods electronically as they go across the country to make sure they end up in the single market, or where they're, you know, it's got a sort of sci-fi, slightly sort of mind-boggling quality.
Yes, it's messy. It is messy, but it might be doable. I don't know whether it is doable or whether it is going to be doable. I don't like it because it's messy, but it might be doable.
But you say it's a basis for negotiation, and one of the things that made it a basis for negotiation is the White Paper said explicitly that the Prime Minister did not expect other EU countries to collect tariffs for the UK at their borders because she recognised that the rest of the EU would be very reluctant to do that.
Well, there was
sorry.
Sorry, forgive me interrupting. I was going to say, well, there was a wrecking amendment in the Commons yesterday.
Well, I was going to ask you about
to
that.
absolutely change that.
So one of the things that was quite striking to me is the European Research Group, the group that brings together the Brexiters, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, put down an amendment saying that actually, that it would bind the hands of the Prime Minister, that Parliament would say she could only have this customs arrangement if she got the agreement of the rest of the EU to remit our customs back to us in the way we were sending customs to them. Now, yesterday morning, I was being told by members of the government that Theresa May couldn't possibly accept that amendment because it would undermine her whole approach to the negotiation. In the afternoon, she capitulates, she gives in, and she accepts all the Brexiters' amendments. What did you make of that?
Well, I'm not in the House of Commons anymore, so I have no idea what brought that about in the Commons, but I can only assume that that position was taken because the Chief Whip had told the Prime Minister she was going to lose the vote. And so the Prime Minister decided to change the government's position and accept the amendment.
Can I just ask you, as somebody who faced challenges like this when you were Prime Minister, probably was a sense of déjà vu, if your Chief Whip comes to you and says there is quite a big risk that we'll lose the vote, is it really better to cave in rather than broadly face them down and explain to them what the risks are? Because it's never a guarantee that you're going to lose the vote.
No, it isn't. It's very difficult to say without having the Chief Whip in front of you and asking him, let's have the names, what is the position, let's see the figures. It's very difficult.
But you fought many times.
Yes, and
Maastricht.
There were many times when we had a vote during the Maastricht debates when we were not sure, when the vote was taken, whether we would win or not. Those occasions did exist, and we did take a risk. The situations aren't entirely comparable. The negotiations on Maastricht were difficult enough in the 1990s, unpleasant in many ways, because fighting your own party is never something that you would wish to do as Prime Minister.
No.
But I think Theresa May is in a more difficult position than I was, facing more committed and hardline opponents and more of them.
So just to be clear, because
I'm not in the position of second guessing what she decided.
Because I'm very struck by what you say, because I was a political editor in the 90s when this was going on. You think that her opponents today are harder to negotiate with, are actually more entrenched than the ones that you faced?
I do.
Gosh, I'm rather shocked by that.
I do think they're more entrenched. And I think, if I may say so, though I say it with huge reluctance, because I have been a member of the Conservative Party since my 16th birthday. It's a thread that is woven through every aspect of my life for the whole of my life. I owe a great deal to the Conservative Party. And I have an affection for it, if you can have an affection for an animate object like that. I have an affection for it that it is difficult to display.
No, of course.
But I think there are some people in the Conservative Party now who are more dedicated to their concerns about getting the UK out of Europe than they are dedicated to what the implications of that may be for their constituents or other people's constituents, or the future of our country, or the interests of our country, or the interests of our party. And I think that there are more of them now than there were in the 1990s, and that is why I see a difference. There is a small, if I might put it this way, there's a bit of a Tea Party grouping within the hardline European research group, And that makes it very difficult to negotiate with them. And I think it must be very hard for the Prime Minister to take rather threatening lectures day after day as to what they will accept when they are actually a minority in the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
So did she make a mistake in conceding to them yesterday, in accepting their amendments?
Well, I'm not in a position to say that because I'm not in the Commons and I don't know what advice was given to her by the Chief Whip.
But if you but normally if you give your enemy an inch, and you're basically saying they are her enemy, they'll take a mile.
Well, I think it would have been better if they had been defeated, but without knowing the background to it, I can't be definitive about how she should have acted yesterday.
But I think the subtext of what you're saying is that these are effectively ideologues who would actually rather have the kind of Brexit that they want than their party in power.
Well,
that they're prepared to take the risk of a Corbyn government, is your view?
I think what they are doing is going to risk a Corbyn government. I think what they are doing is quite likely to lead to a much earlier general election than anybody is anticipating. Whether that would be this autumn or next spring, I can't say. But I think the way they're continually chipping away against the unity of the government, and you have people in government who we are told through the media are thinking about whether they should resign or not. Well, frankly, if they're thinking about whether they should resign, they should be asked to go out and support the government's policy or decide that they will resign. Sitting there in the middle of the cabinet or in the middle of government, letting it be known that they're sitting there deciding whether they wish to continue to give the government their support is an intolerable position for any Prime Minister to be put into.
Now, I'm slightly reluctant to ask you this, partly because I think there were times when you were Prime Minister when you didn't always welcome the advice of a previous Prime Minister. But would you be prepared to give some advice to Theresa May about how she should move forward on this most important of issues, how we leave the EU?
I speak out on these issues very rarely.
No.
I don't do many interviews, and I think I entirely understand that I am yesterday. It is 28 years since I became Prime Minister and 21 years since I ceased to be Prime Minister. There are many people in Parliament that I haven't met. I don't think I'm best placed to give detailed advice to the Prime Minister what she should do in these circumstances.
No, but you were at the heart of government, and you're at the heart, and you know, you've seen these institutions evolve.
Let me finish. So I don't think I'm best placed to do that. I think it is reasonable for me to comment on what I think the implications are going to be for the country if we get all this wrong. But as for suddenly riding up on a white horse and giving advice to the Prime Minister, I'm much more reluctant about that. In politics, you need to know the personalities. You need to be absolutely clear about the dynamics.
Sure.
You need to know the figures. Politics is a numbers game in terms of the House of Commons. Now, I'm not in there. I don't have the same feel for the House of Commons, and I freely concede that somebody who actually sits in the Commons may be, and there will be people in the Commons who disagree sharply with what I've said today because they'll say I've misunderstood what's going on in the House of Commons. Perfectly legitimate for them to say that. But I think I have a perfect right and a duty in some ways, since I believe this is going to be disastrous for the country, to speak out on the direction of policy and where I think it is going and what I think it might mean. But I don't think I'm best placed to offer day-to-day advice to the Prime Minister. And as you delicately pointed out, I wasn't always grateful when I got it in my day.
Look, there are a couple of topical issues which I'd like to put to you. One is Parliament, after we speak, will take a decision about whether to go on holiday a few days early. Now, some people think this is a slightly odd decision for them to make, given that, you know, there are quite a few big decisions outstanding. What? I mean, it's not really a great look, is it, for the government to sort of...
Well, I'm less concerned about the look than about the reality.
Okay.
We've got a relatively few days to negotiate and a relatively few days to discuss what the negotiations are.
Yeah.
It would have seemed to me more appropriate in present circumstances for Parliament. Of course, Parliament need a holiday. They must be exhausted. They've been working in a very high, intense attitude. Of course, they need a break. But it seems to me that they should be cutting down their summer break, given the time scale till October and the time scale to next March, rather than enhancing it. So I think it's rather surprising that the proposition is being put that they should leave early.
And there's also a sort of related, in my view, well, it's almost a paradox, which is many people, and I've sort of written a book that looks at this, would say there are some pretty fundamental structural problems in this country at the moment, which would need to be fixed whether we are in or out of the EU. But the sheer amount of government effort that's required to negotiate a decent Brexit deal means that actually the volume of initiatives, the volume of government business aimed at solving those structural problems has shrunk. That actually, Parliament is doing much less in other areas than it should, many people would say, be doing. So there's a sort of tragedy about Brexit, which is whether you're in favour of Brexit or not, it is paralysing the government's ability to fix other things.
The opportunity cost of Brexit in terms of parliamentary time, the damage has been extraordinary. We have a whole series of problems in our country. They haven't just grown up under this government. No. They've grown up over 20, 30 years.
Totally right.
And every government for the last 30 or 40 years must bear, including the one I was Prime Minister of, must accept a share of the blame. But we have some really serious problems. Our country is arguably more divided at this moment than at any time I can recall in my political life. Divided between the component parts, England and Scotland, Wales and Ireland are divided completely on Brexit. The regions of those countries are divided on different issues. We have a division between rich and poor, between north and south, between investment in some areas and no investment in others. There's a whole range of ways in which our country is divided. And unless we are very careful, there are going to be very serious complications for that. For example, I don't believe in the short term that Scotland can leave the Union for economic reasons. There's too big a black hole. But that isn't going to be so forever. And if I were to contemplate, will Scotland be in the Union in 20 years' time, I would be very concerned about that, because those economic disadvantages may have disappeared within those 20 years. And unless we are beginning to warm up the relationship with Scotland, instead of seeing it constantly continue in a cool and hostile way, there is a real risk that Scotland will go. There is, for different reasons, a real risk in Northern Ireland as well, particularly given that Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union, and the country as a whole voted to stay out. So there's real problems about the union itself. There are real arguments about the state of the nation and what the role of the state should be. But then on a more personal level, in education, in health, in skill training, there's a huge amount that actually needs to be done. The difference in economic well-being in different parts of the country is larger than is sustainable. That gap has got to be narrowed. And it's got to be narrowed in terms of where the investment goes, and it's got to be narrowed in terms of where the opportunities are there for people to develop the maximum skills that they have. We need massive education reform. One particular area where we need it, well, we need it in many areas, of course, but one that strikes me as being particularly pertinent if we're to leave the European Union is skill training. Now, we have a huge number of academic establishments. We have a relatively small number of establishments teaching manual skills, bricklaying, roofing, electronics, mechanics. We need those. I think there's a very strong case for examining whether you should look at the school curriculum from age 14 or 15 and give parents and pupils a choice whether they go down the academic route. Of course, they've got to continue with maths and English, but the academic route or the practical route with greater opportunities for them begin to learn skilled trades. And we've got to socially accept that the man in the blue collar is as valuable and in many cases more valuable than the man in the white collar.
One of the tragedies of this country is that we've had this hierarchy
between gone on forever. Well,
technical and non-technical.
But Brexit brings it to a head. Brexit means we've got to do
industrial changes, economic changes, which are proceeding at a pace that frankly none of us have witnessed. I mean, this is enormous turmoil wherever you look.
Well, the root of all this
Yep.
is making sure that infrastructure investment improves productivity. The principal problem with productivity is not that workers don't work hard enough or long enough. It's that
You don't have the structure
you don't
around
have the
them.
structure or the investment.
No, totally right.
Now, we need that structure and investment in the areas of high unemployment, in the northeast, in South Wales, to a lesser extent, but still vitally in the northwest and in the Midlands. And we've got to look at exactly how that works and actually do it. We've had a whole decade of interest rates absolutely on the floor.
Yeah.
And it was an ideal opportunity for industry and government to borrow for that infrastructure. And that problem is going to be there in the future, but it is going to magnify in the future because the fact that we are so divided is now more apparent to people than it has been in the past. And they can now look around and they can see the disparity between their particular opportunities and the opportunities of others. And I think that was a significant part of the way the Brexit vote went.
I'm sure
the people who are dispossessed, the people who are poorly paid or unpaid.
No, a majority of people on low incomes
agreed.
voted for Brexit. And one of the other great paradoxes is, as you've said, there is a reasonable probability that if Brexit goes wrong, the people who will be hurt hardest are the very poorest people who actually voted to leave the EU. And I think there's a great risk actually that they end up not blaming Brexit, but blaming the people who run this place. And one of the things that I think is a concern is the rise of extremism as a result of people feeling disappointed.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that is right. But I think in some ways it goes even wider than that, because there's discontent in other areas as well. We have a huge hunger for more people to become homeowners, for example. And that is a problem. And it's a problem. When Sajid Javid went to the Home Office, he said, we've got to take on NIMBYism. And my heart lifted, because I think that is exactly right. Nobody has
argued. It's slightly odd, isn't it, to have a Conservative Party, the party of capitalism, frankly, not giving people opportunities to accumulate capital.
Well, I think we should give people more opportunities to accumulate capital. But that can't be done just by the tax system, which itself is in bad need of reform.
No, but if people can't afford to get on the housing ladder, that's a big issue, isn't it?
Well, we have to look at the whole series of things. I think there are things that can be done that are very big things. There's no silver bullet to solve this overnight. But there's a huge amount of land. I would like to see, I suppose you might call it a doomsday book of developable land, to lay out all the land that could be developed in the next 30 years. I think then we can see where the opportunities are, and we can then see that the green belt isn't to be destroyed and you remove one of those shibboleths. Though every piece of greenery in the country can't be sacrosanct while people have no homes. But when you do that, if you actually do that, you've then got to tackle the other things that are making it impossible to build homes.
Of course.
The planning system is a mess. It's slow, it's expensive. Stamp duty is silting up the market at the top, and that is rippling all the way down. I don't think the stamp duty at the top is helping anyone, and I'd be prepared to bet that government revenues are beginning to fall. It would be a very good idea, for example, to reduce stamp duty quite significantly to regenerate interest in building houses, and maybe tax undeveloped land on a progressive basis. If it's undeveloped a year after it's given planning permission, 5% tax, 2 years, 10%, 3 years, 15%, and so on. There are other ways, more progressive ways, in which we can raise that money and help people get on the housing ladder, because the job of the government, the fundamental, I've returned to this point, the fundamental responsibility of the government after national defence and security is the well-being of people.
Absolutely.
And to help them meet their dreams. And one of their dreams is home ownership. It's got to be a really sharp and fundamental attack on this problem.
Now, we haven't got a lot of time left. There are just 2 or 3 other things I wanted to pick up with you. One is we talked about the risk of disappointed people becoming angry. Today, there are quite a lot of people angry because the Electoral Commission has ruled that the main campaigners to leave broke the rules when it came to how much they spent, broke the rules quite significantly, overspent by £500,000, which is a lot of money in the context of a short campaign. Are people right to feel that this was a slightly rigged game?
I don't know whether that would have changed the result. Plainly, there's a law and it should be obeyed,
Yep.
and the law must now be enforced. And plainly, that is going to happen, has been partly happened with the fine, I think, that has been levied this morning, and with action that may be taken against individuals.
But it doesn't undermine the result, in your view?
Well, I think what undermines the result is that people voted on things that were not true. They voted on a prospectus that was quite false. They voted on promises that are undeliverable, and must have been known to people that were undeliverable at the time. When we have got a Brexit agreement, it will be very interesting to lay out what was promised and what the Brexit agreement looks like, and see how different it is. And that is where the case for the House of Commons intervening, or there being a second referendum, will actually most arise, when people can see the reality. We were talking of housing. Let me put it to you in these terms. Would you buy a house without knowing the price? No, you would not. Should we leave the European Union without knowing the cost? Arguably, we should not. We voted for a pig in the poke. We voted for what we were told would be the case, without any costings, without any indication of the downsides of leaving. And whenever experts pointed them out, it was Operation Fear.
Yeah.
And experts were derided and degraded. We mustn't believe experts, in order that their words would not be believed.
Yeah.
But it is now becoming apparent that many of the warnings, although precipitate, in terms that it was silly to say everything was going to collapse straight away.
Overnight, yeah, sure.
That was silly. But we're now seeing a whole wealth of evidence from almost every source that we are going to be progressively poorer as a result of leaving the European Union.
I mean, many would say the only thing you need to look at is, over the past year and a bit, the global economy is growing at levels we haven't seen since before the crash, and the growth rate of the UK has fallen very significantly.
We are very lucky the world is growing, or we would have fallen even further.
Well, that is the point.
I mean,
that
we
many
have
make.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we were the top of the G7 growth table. We're now at the bottom.
As I said, we haven't got a lot of time. Sadly, it's been actually a gripping conversation. For me, it's slightly odd in a way that we're having this long conversation now. I don't know if you remember, but back in the 1990s when we first met and you were Prime Minister, I think the longest interview that I'd done with you till today was during that period when you put yourself up, as it were, for re-election. I came into your office when I was political editor of the FT and did an interview in the middle of your campaign to be re-elected as Tory leader, the famous Put Up or Shut Up campaign, which you won decisively, and it got you through to the next election. There are some people who believe that this Prime Minister has got to deal with her critics by basically calling them out and saying to them, look, you want to get rid of me, let's have that vote of confidence. Do you think there is a case for her to face down her critics and say, right, here it is, you've got the opportunity, have that vote of confidence, and if I win, I'm here for the duration?
Well, there's certainly a case. But you asked me a few minutes ago if I'd advised the Prime Minister. I don't know.
No.
I don't know that I would advise her to do that.
What persuaded you back then to do what you did? It was a very daring thing to do at the time.
Well, because it was intolerable to go on in the way we were, and I knew we were coming up to a party conference. I knew what people were manoeuvring. Almost everything we did was frustrated by these constant whispers, this constant manoeuvring, this constant plotting, much of it self-interested plotting.
Yep.
And it seemed to me we had to... I wasn't prepared to continue on that basis. You said I won it decisively. If I remember, I got 218 votes to 80 odd. And I had set a threshold. I had in my pocket an envelope which had a number on it. And if I had fallen below that number, I would have resigned, even though I had won the vote.
Yeah.
And I
do you want to share with me what that number was?
Yes, the number was 215.
Right. Oh my goodness.
I passed it.
Close.
I passed it by 3 votes.
Crikey.
And if I had had 3 votes, or 4 votes less, I would have resigned. And
what was your thinking? What was the magic about 215?
Well, it was really a subjective judgment as to what was credible to continue in terms of support within your own party. And if the support fell below that level, I didn't think it was really credible. And politics wasn't the end of the world. I would go away and do something else, and I would wish my successor good luck. So I was perfectly prepared to resign. I didn't wish to resign, but I was perfectly prepared to. But It saw the enemies off to a point, opponents I should say, not enemies, off to a point, but in many ways it wasn't terribly successful. And we saw what a divided party faces when we came to the election. Divided parties do not win elections. And if the Conservative Party divided then, and it led us to a remarkable election defeat. Admittedly, it was at the end of 18 years of government. There were lots of things behind it, apart from the divisions. No doubt my own inabilities as well. But I don't think the situation is quite the same. I wouldn't advise the Prime Minister to do that at this moment.
So how does the party come together? Because you have made the point that divided parties rarely get re-elected, and your party at the moment is more divided. I mean, it's a paradox given that David Cameron held the referendum because he thought it would unite the party ultimately, but your party is more divided than at any time, well, any of us alive can remember.
I strongly oppose Brexit, as I have said repeatedly. But there are perfectly credible reasons in the minds of some people to oppose it. There are many people who oppose it in a perfectly civilised and parliamentary manner. They don't menace the Prime Minister. They don't go out and cause mischief for the Prime Minister. They don't seek to frustrate what the Prime Minister does. They just disagree with it. Those people, once this matter is over, can be brought back in the fold without any difficulty, I think. We've always had a right wing and a left wing, and the Tory party needs them both to be balanced.
All parties are coalitions.
Of course, we're a coalition, as all parties are, and it needs both a right wing and a left wing. So my disagreement is not with the right wing per se, or with people who vote for Brexit per se. My concern are about those people who are a touch too fanatical about the issue and are really prepared to go to almost any lengths to ensure that we leave Europe, irrespective of the cost to the country, irrespective of the cost of individuals, irrespective of the cost to the Prime Minister, irrespective of the cost to the party, irrespective of anything but their own fanatical determination to make sure we actually leave Europe. Now, I'm not sure how you bring those people back in the fold. The rest, I'm fairly confident we will be able to do.
Well, on that, I'm not sure whether that's a depressing or just realistic note, but it's very, very good to talk to you, Sir John. Thank you so much for coming in. Absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thank you.